Elon Musk and Steve Bannon and Vladimir Putin all made a winning bet on Donald Trump, but so did Chief Supreme Court Justice John Roberts. Slate senior writer Mark Joseph Stern writes, "You have to hand it to John Roberts. The Chief Justice played his cards right. For more than a year now, Roberts has largely dropped his pose as an institutionalist, let alone a moderate. He has instead thrown his weight behind Donald Trump, reestablishing his control over the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority. These apparent acts of self-preservation, seemingly undertaken in anticipation of a second Trump term, turned out to be the smart bet. At the dawn of Trump's next term, Roberts will arguably hold more power than ever." Joining me now is Mark Joseph Stern, who covers the courts and the law for Slate Magazine. Mark, thank you for being here. I have wanted to talk about the role of the courts since Tuesday night, and I'm eager to hear how you sort of envision the relationship between what Trump wants to do and where John Roberts sits in the course of the next 4 years.
Yeah, so first of all, let's be clear. John Roberts is a huge reason why Donald Trump was able to retake the White House. It was John Roberts who maneuvered a decision allowing Trump to get back on the ballot after Colorado removed him and other states were threatening to. And of course, it was John Roberts who gave him the sweeping immunity from prosecution that delayed Trump's trial and essentially now let him off the hook for charges over election subversion and theft of classified documents. But, you know, going deeper than that, I think that the John Roberts of today really shares a vision of governance with Donald Trump, which was not necessarily the case in Trump's first term. I think that John Roberts, for a variety of reasons, has shifted to the right and come to really embrace the kind of MAGA vision of governance in a way that he did not even 4 years ago. And so what we're going to see now is a fusion of kind of Trump law as led by Roberts on the Supreme Court, and of course, the Trump White House itself, and an allyship between those two branches of government that I think is potentially going to shift law and policy in this country considerably more than it would have if Roberts had decided to remain independent and even act as a guardrail against Trump, as he once did, but probably won't now.
Yeah, it's, I mean, John Roberts' evolution on MAGA mirrors that of the Republican Party, right? For a while, it sort of tried to resist the siren's call of Trump, but eventually capitulates to it and refashions itself in Trump's image. I mean, I'm not sure Roberts has gone that far, but on the very big top line promises of the Trump candidacy, whether it's mass deportation camps, whether it's tinkering around with contraception or abortion, or whether it's, you know, rescinding the gay marriage rights and gay rights more broadly, where do you think Roberts can make the sort of biggest impact?
You know, I think one major area will be Trump's effort to take over the federal government, to purge the civil service, to fire holdovers or anyone who stands in his way and tries to slow down his agenda or block illegal acts. Roberts has adopted the unitary executive theory in a big way over the last few years, not really to Joe Biden's advantage because Biden has played by the old rules, but in a way that sets the stage for Trump to act more like a king than arguably any other president in history. He's going to come in on day one and fire a ton of people who just, 5-10 years ago would have been protected by the law thanks to Roberts' decisions. And then, when we get to the government doing its job, protecting people, carrying out Congress's commands, as you and I have discussed, John Roberts has seriously weakened all of the federal agencies that do that day in, day out work of protecting Americans and executing the law. And Trump will immediately begin to try to further that goal, to gut the civil servants who are, responsible for doing that work, to weaken agencies, to issue a series of executive decisions and rules and regulations that essentially defy Congress's will and render these agencies totally toothless. Behind the scenes on the stuff that matters, I think Roberts and Trump are sort of in a handshake agreement here. And it's a bit shocking to remember. It was only 6-7 years ago that John Roberts was stopping Trump from repealing DACA, protecting Dreamers from Trump's wrath, stopping Trump from meddling with the census. This Roberts would never do any of that. And again, the fusion is going to carry both men much further down their dream policy paths.
What do you think of the other Supreme Court justices? I mean, you and I have talked about this. I think on the air, maybe not, about Alito and Thomas, right? Thomas is 76 and Alito is 74. And there has been some scuttlebutt that they were waiting for Trump to get another term before they decided to announce. They might decide to announce their potential retirement. Do you think that that is something that is on the horizon, given how strident those two men have been and how much they helped Donald Trump win re-election through their delays and court opinions?
So I am very confident that Samuel Alito will announce his retirement this spring and step down at the end of this term. He hates Washington. He's tired of the job. He has shown markedly less enthusiasm for doing it in recent years. He's ready to go. And the Trump lawyers already have a replacement lined up in former Alito clerk Andrew Oldham, a far-right extremist on the Fifth Circuit, one of the most extreme conservative jurists in the country. He will likely be anointed to replace Alito. He'll be very much like Alito, but 30 years younger. And he'll be able to potentially shift the gravity of the court more in his direction. Alito doesn't try to make coalitions or allyships anymore. You know, he's off doing his own thing. But put in someone younger who can sort of speak the language of Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, and that might shift the court. Clarence Thomas, I think he has more hubris. I think he still likes the job more. I'm not certain he'll leave. He's often said that he won't for some years, that he wants to hang on and won't leave unless it's in a pine box. But I think that Trump will be able to do the charm offensive on Clarence Thomas that he did on Anthony Kennedy to get Kennedy to retire in 2018, to wine and dine him, to pressure politely his wife and family. You know, Ginny Thomas will be speaking with Trump a great deal in the coming months and years. And if Trump can convince Ginny to tell her husband to retire, I think that Justice Thomas may well step down and be replaced by someone similarly extreme, but much, much younger.
Well, we have a lot to look forward to. Mark Joseph Stern, thank you, my friend, for your thoughts and wisdom tonight.
Thanks so much.